We appreciate you being here today, and we appreciate you helping to make that a reality. But we're going to jump in now. We're up on Facebook, so welcome to people who are watching us there. And we're reading the second story because, as I mentioned last week, as we're going through Genesis now, we're going to be going through the stories of Genesis. We're going to be reading them as units. And in some cases, that doesn't line up with chapters. In some cases, uh, this is as we're going to see today. We start in chapter 2, verse 4, and in some cases, the stories, the units are as they are today. Uh, Obviously, the works of different people. And by the way, by that I say we don't spend a lot of time talking about the documentary hypothesis, but in this case, let's just say these two stories were so obviously written by different people with a different agenda. Now, they've been woven together, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, and they've been placed together. I would say woven together. We're going to look at the story of the flood. That is a story where the stories are woven together. The two different versions are literally woven together. But here we have two that are placed side by side, I would say, and they are complementary to each other to such a level that traditionally people have had no issue with the fact that there's seemingly massive contradictions between the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. And if you weren't here last week, I would definitely encourage you, because it's been posted, to go back and watch the class from last week to see what we talked about in Genesis chapter 1, the first creation story. The creation story generally ascribed by biblical scholars to the author we call the priestly author, the P author. Today we're going to read the first work of the J author, the author who is called J not because he's from Judah or she's from Judah. The author, we don't know who the author is, and so it could be male or female. We really do believe the person's from the tribe of Judah for reasons that we'll see when we get to obvious tips of the hand, if you will. But uh, the author's called the J author because they use a word for God that's different than the other authors in some cases, and that is they use the word Adonai, Yud He Vav He, which, as we know from previous discussions, and here's the word right here, it's usually translated as eternal, or as we sometimes say Hashem, the name, or sometimes we say Adonai, which means Lord. The Yud He Vav He name we do not pronounce, though some people have tried, and some people have tried ridiculously incorrectly, with the name Jehovah. And Jehovah begins with a J, because in German it is pronounced with a Y, but in English it just came out with a J because it was written with a J and it has a J sound, but it does not have a J sound in Hebrew because there is no J sound in Hebrew. So it is clearly and most definitely not the name of God, which is why I say it without feeling guilty about saying it. But the author is called the J author because he uses that name exclusively, almost exclusively, for the name of God. The other authors oftentimes use the word Elohim, which means literally God, or the Godhead, if you will, but we always translate it as God. So when you see translations that say the word Elohim, like it does in verse 3, and then in the next line you say Adonai, that is a definite tip of who's writing what section. Now, it's 99% effective in finding out. There's a couple of places where Adonai and Elohim are used together in the same phrase. But generally speaking, that's the way that when people first started picking apart the authors and saying, well, this is written by one author and this is written by another author, there was a German scholar by the name of Julius Wellhausen, and Wellhausen was the one who first said, hey, there's a J author and there's an E author. The E author uses the word Elohim. And eventually we said, no, there's not one author that uses the word Elohim. There's two authors, and that's the Elohist author and also the priestly author uses the word for God. Now, I don't want to dwell a lot on it. I just want to give you the basic rudimentary concepts of biblical the documentary hypothesis. As I said before, if you want to read more about it, and I encourage you to, read Who Wrote the Bible by my professor, Richard Friedman. And one of the great books that kind of hits what we're going to talk about today, particular, is the author J. And Friedman's uh, hypothesis that this amazing author um, was actually an author who wrote the first great book of the Bible. This is his book called Hidden Book of the Bible. His first bestseller, if you will, was Who Wrote the Bible, which is why it says right here, author of Who Wrote the Bible. But Hidden Book of the Bible follows the book, the author J, and how this author J wrote a book that stretches from Genesis all the way through the book of Kings. And as you can see, the discovery of the first prose masterpiece. If he's correct in his theory, and it's not just his theory, he bases his theory on lots of previous scholarship. But if he's correct in his theory, then he's also correct in calling that person the first great prose author. It's not exactly a novelist, the J author, but the person is a tremendous narrator slash um, I would say, considering what we'd be looking at as far as pages go. Yeah.
Does he have a new book out?
I don't know if he has a new book out. I know that he's written a couple other books since. He's not writing as much. He wrote a book called The Bible and Now, which is, I think, one of his last books, which talks about how the Bible relates to things that people say it relates to in politics. So it's a pretty cool book. But yeah, he's definitely not writing as much as he used to. I was actually his student while he was writing Who Wrote the Bible. So it was kind of cool to watch him develop that and teach from it and realize that this is going to be a book that for a Bible book is going to sell pretty well. And in fact, it did. So it was kind of cool for him to go over and like kind of test it out as he was composing it. So again, and we'll deal with it. I'll share that stuff when it's relevant and when it adds something to that. This discussion today and looking at kind of where we are with the story of Genesis chapter 2, which I would call it Meet the Humans, because in chapter 1 they're created and we do get introduced to the humans, but we really don't know much about them. They're created and they're basically given, like the animals, the order to be fertile and increase, pru or vu. They're also, by the way, very important, created in the divine image, but they're more categories than characters, I would say. They are like the other creations, and of course, God says you have food to eat, which is food that has seeds in them, not animals, but you are given permission to control the animals, right? They are also given only permission to eat vegetables. So it seems like the first animals are also all vegetarian. And but God gives them responsibility to control the earth, to master the earth. But that mastering of the earth, the responsibility for caring for the earth, doesn't interestingly include permission to eat them. And I will tell you, well, it doesn't say they're given permission, but clearly they're given permission. No, they will be given permission to eat the animals, but in about 8 chapters. So they are not originally given
Sarah
permission
pointed out to me
animals.
that there's no blessing for eating meat. I hadn't
There is
realized
no
it.
blessing for eating meat. That is correct.
I
That's
hadn't.
one of the reasons why we could say that traditional Judaism at least recognizes that, if you will. But again, in Genesis chapter 2, yeah, I'm not going to preach the vegetarianism from this, which I could, because this is the basis for why I became this and the next and the part we'll get to soon. It was actually the part we get to soon where people are given permission to eat animals. Maybe I'll talk about it a little bit more
It was
then.
just pretty amazing because for Tu B'Shvat, I was teaching the kids it's a blessing for everything.
Yeah,
rainbows, everything, but no for
you're
meat.
you're
So that's
absolutely right. And thank you, Gail.
sidebar.
Thank you for reminding us, Gail, that yesterday was Tu B'Shvat. So
Uh,
the holiday of the trees was yesterday. We did our Tu B'Shvat Seder with our kids at Hebrew school on Sunday. It is a wonderful time to think about nature and to think about it, which we did a little bit last week. I should have said something a little bit more about Tu B'Shvat and our runoff. That's the 15th. That's the 15th day of the month of Shvat. Tet Vav of Shvat. That's how it literally means the 15th day of Shvat, and it's when we date every tree is dated. If it was planted before the 15th, it's last year's produce. If it's planted after, it's the next year's produce. And why is that important? Because you can't pick from the trees until after they've grown for 3 years. And so you needed to know how old these trees were before you could pluck them. And it's an interesting idea too that we get in rabbinic Judaism. It's not in the Torah, but it is, I would say, kind of based on this idea that we're responsible for plants. We're going to read in the Bible in Deuteronomy, we're not allowed to cut down fruit trees if we go to war against a place. We're not allowed to cut down the fruit trees, not allowed to cut down trees that have benefit and are beneficial for people, for life. And as Gail said, we have blessings for eating stuff from trees, but no blessing to eat something that we've killed. So
And
again,
two,
I want
Shvat kind of ties into it's a garden. Genesis is where the caretakers of the garden and the earth.
yes,
All of
which
that.
is definitely what we read a little bit more in this one. I will tell you again, when we look at what Eden is, which we're going to meet Eden, because you notice here, it's not called Eden. He creates them, but it doesn't say anything here about the garden. Now, the fact that it's mentioned in chapter 2 and not in chapter 1, people will just say, okay, but it's not talking about that. But you could also say, this is kind of like people are set loose in this. Chapter 2, we're going to see, is very different. If you didn't have chapter 1, you would come away with very different conclusions about the creation of people. Now, you're going to see right away the differences in the authors. That's what's really beautiful about reading these two stories side by side. And it would be a lot easier for a lot easier, a lot easier for us if you were not here to listen to chapter 1. I'm just laughing. Judith said that there is a shechianu for a perfectly cooked steak. How can you say that, Judith? Judith, that's
Just
hurtful.
to just to mess with you
I
because
know, but
it's early in the
you could put it in
morning.
the chat.
No, that's so true, though.
I know, right,
So
John?
true. I'm telling
Something
you.
that John
Everyone's
and I agree on.
I'm telling you.
everyone's turning on me right now. I will tell you, I will tell you that I wasn't even going to go there, but yes, but thank you for reminding us. Chapter 2 is a different I should say chapter 2 starting in verse 4, because the first three verses are about Shabbat. It's interesting, again, the chapters and verses, I've said this many, many times, bears repeating right now, were put here by Christian scholars. Christian scholars didn't see, and I don't think it was fully intentional, that Shabbat is a key part of this story of creation. They like the fact, I don't think it was intentional, because look, there's a nice break here, which is the heaven and earth were finished in all their array. Um, and then it gets into the creation of like, then it gets into the description of the people, which are no longer seen as a creation, right? Because as we start with verse 4, which we'll do now, uh yeah, if you read at the beginning of the chapter in verse 1, you don't realize that, hey, wait a second, this line is the beginning of a new story. And one of the ways we know that is by the Hebrew. The Hebrew here says Ele Toldot. Whenever we find a phrase Ele Toldot, it's oftentimes translated, the word Toldot is oftentimes translated as generations. But we also understand Ele Toldot is like, here's the story of, here's the tale of how this happened. Here is, I'm going to teach you a little something about once upon a time, you know? That's what Ella Toldot kind of is. Once upon a time in Hebrew, and we have it throughout Jay. When Jay wants to tell us a little tale, Jay will say Ella Toldot. Now again, Toldot is definitely connected to the word Yalad or Yalid or Nolad, which means to be born. But for Genesis in particular, and I would say throughout Jay is teaching us why things are the way they are. The priestly author is just telling us this is what happens, and this is it. It's God did it, and it's done. It's almost again the once upon a time, and why did this happen? Why is it like this? And it's very much the case here in Genesis chapter 2. We're going to get why are we like we are? Why are human beings the way we are? And we're going to see it very much so in the next few stories, which are really Jay stories. The garden and Cain and Abel's story. So chapter 1 and then looking at this side by side, you really do see how different these authors are and what their agenda is, you know? So we're going to get into Eden now. And I played last week. I told you I'm going to try to find a little musical accompaniment for every session. Last week it was Woodstock from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and the fact that the garden is at least in Genesis chapter 1 pretty nice. This garden also at least starts out nice, but doesn't continue to be nice. We look at the garden and the song looks at the garden as like heaven is like what we try to get back to. And we do call heaven the Gan Eden. We do call it that. But I think you're going to be surprised that when we look at Gan Eden in chapter 2, let me offer this. Eden isn't paradise, it's a laboratory. Keep that in mind as we read this. Maybe it's a laboratory. Any questions, any comments, anything from last week that people want to say before we jump into another story? And we will try to bring the stories together by the time we get through this. But let's take a look at chapter 2. And if Rosemary, if you'd start reading, and by the way, as I said last week, if someone else wants to read, just text in the box. I'm not gonna put people on the spot to read, but we definitely want to bring in other people to share these parts of these stories. But the first verses, we're gonna have Rosemary read, and again, just text me, or you can privately text me if you want to do some of the reading. And we're going to start with the first part of this story, which is Eden. So, Rosemary?
And God blessed the seventh
Oh,
day.
no, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Verse
Where do you
4.
want me to start?
Yeah, verse 4, sorry. Yeah.
Verse 4. Okay. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. When the eternal God made earth and heaven, when no shrub of the field was yet on earth, and no grasses of the field had yet sprouted, because the eternal God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there were no human beings to till the soil. But a flow would well up from the ground and water the whole surface of the earth. The eternal God formed a human from the soil's humus, blowing into his nostrils the breath of life. The human became a living being.
Yeah. This is a totally different creation story. And every time you read it as a separate creation story and not rush through it as one Torah portion, you're like, oh, yeah, this is a totally different story. First of all, human beings were not created from humus, not hummus. They're not created from humus.
Some of us are.
Israelis would like to say that we were created from hummus, but it's not that kind of hummus. It's hummus. Actually, I know people who pronounce that like if you want to say hummus, like Israelis, but hummus. Yeah, it's the earth. We're created min ha'adamah. We're from the Adamah. We're from the earth. And that's why we're called Adam. We're called Adam because we come from the earth. We're created out of the earth. We're made out of the earth. Yes, and I know we're going to get to the key line about the earth and us being from the earth and going back to the earth. Yeah, it all works because we're the earth. We're earthmen. We're literally earthmen. We're from the earth. Hadam. Min ha'adamah. Now, what of course is glaringly obvious here is that this story says that this is a story of how heaven and earth were created. And it says that when human beings were created in this version, there was no earth, there was no grass on the earth. There's nothing else. There's no animals, as we're about to see, and um,
No plants.
there's no water really yet. I mean, there is water, but it was water that's coming out of the earth. You know, there's a well in Eden, but yeah, it's like the earth isn't ready yet. Now you could say, well, how how do you rectify this? Like, this is so glaringly obvious. And then we're going to talk about how the rabbis rectify this, because the rabbis can never say, hey, this is two different authors. This is Eden. Eden is where this is happening. There's stuff everywhere else. It's just not in Eden.
It's interesting. It's interesting though,
It
Rabbi.
kicks off right at the beginning, which is this is the story of how heaven and earth were created. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because if you scroll back to 130, right? And to all the animals on the land, right?
Yeah.
It's a quite a contradiction to me, at least.
Yeah, it's a huge contradiction. The reason that people have allowed this to happen is because they've said that this is a micro view of what happened. This is the micro, this is the version where we zoom in to it. That's allowed them to make sense of this. Again, I think it's difficult to make that argument rationally, but if you can't say that there's two different versions, you got to come up with something. Like I said, I feel much more comfortable saying these are two different people with a different agenda, with a different idea that they want to create, they want to give to us. And there's things we can learn from both. And they're not mutually exclusive from the standpoint of teaching us something. And they both teach us important lessons. Well, I'll get to it. I'll get to one of my favorite lessons, but not yet. I want to share that at the end. One of the great rabbinic takeaways are by these two different stories. Okay. But oh my gosh, I mean, there's so much in this story. Honestly, this could wind up being this could wind up being two classes because there's so much here. But let's get moving. Uh, so I just want to make sure I make that note. It's very important for me to share that at the end. But yeah, let's keep going. So they're created out of the earth, and God literally blows life into us, which is an amazing idea, which is that God puts a nephesh into us. A nephesh puts a spirit into us that is divine. So in the first story, we're created in the divine image. In this version, we also are divine through this nephesh, through this energy that keeps us going, which is the nephesh that God blows into us at the beginning, this animating spirit, if you will. So this is a beautiful creation story too. All right, and then what happens to us?
The eternal God planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the human who had been fashioned. And from the ground, the eternal God caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. A river issues from Eden to water the garden, and then it divides and becomes 4 branches.
So we're in Eden, which says is in the east, which is why there's like a book called East of Eden, which we're going to actually talk about next week, by John Steinbeck. Yeah. And the garden had these trees in the middle of it, right? with clearly the focal points. And there's two trees, right? There's the tree of life, and then there's the tree of knowledge of good and bad. So those are told at the beginning. These are the center, if you will, of the garden. And the garden and the human being is placed there. Right now, again, it's only one human being. And you notice here too that I will point out, it says Adonai Elohim. It uses both words together. So sometimes the J author does use the word Elohim. So you can't just say, well, the J author only uses J. No. But here it's God plants the garden, right? God actually creates the laboratory, builds the home, builds the venue for where this is all going to happen. Which is, again, maybe why some people said, well, this is the story of Eden. It's not the story of all of humanity. It's the story of Eden. Okay, well, let's cover some ground here. The river is in out of Eden, and then it splits into 4 different branches. And here's what it says.
The name of the first is Pishon, the one that winds through the whole land of Havilah, where the gold is. The gold of that land is good. Bdellium is there, and lapis lazuli. The name of the second river is Gihon, the one that winds through the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, the one that flows east of Ashur, and the fourth river is the Euphrates.
Yeah, so this is a story of the rivers of the world, the key rivers of the world. We only know what a couple, well, we know for sure that one of these rivers is the Tigris. It says so. The Hiddekel is what it's called in there is the Tigris. The other one is called the Parat. The Greeks called it the Euphrates, which means the good Parat, the good Parat. Eu means good, right? Like euthanasia, a good death. Parat means the good Phrates, the good Parat. In Hebrew, the Hiddekel is what is closer to what the Assyrians called the Tigris. Gihon, it seems to be when it talks about the land of Cush. What is it? The Nile.
The Nile.
Yeah. And then this other river, the Pishon, this seems to be a river that is maybe somewhere in Yemen or Saudi Arabia, but it's not a river that we're 100% sure what it is. The story here is definitely kind of talking about a primordial spring that fed the great rivers of the world, or at least the great rivers of the Middle East. It's important, very important for this author to establish this kind of, and again, one of the things we see in Jay is a lot of these kind of mythic stories, these mythic elements. And so what we're left with in some cases are explanations for things that we don't really know why it was important, but it was important. Definitely, it's explaining that there's gold in these areas. There's gold in them Dar Hills, right? There's rivers that are super important for civilization. So they're important. And we know that some of them were like, that's where civilization began. In between the Tigris and Euphrates, that's called Mesopotamia, between the rivers. So we know these areas are important, and they're most definitely important, but there's something here that's mythic, which is this explanation of the kind of this primordial water source that feeds the great rivers of the Middle East. And so it's a story that, like, we don't get the full impact of because we don't live in the area. But if we did, we'd probably also understand, and there probably are similar myths that are in other texts that are, yeah, this is kind of like, yeah, and this is our version of it. So again, it's not part of like our consciousness, but it was definitely part of our ancestors' consciousness that tell us that these rivers actually all came out of Eden. Now,
Hey,
people use this mythic river source, if you will, to try to know, where is Eden? Where was it? Like, can we find it? Based on where these rivers emerge out of, or where they would converge from, I guess you could say it that way. Uh, can we figure out where it was? And so I would say people definitely get focused on that, though it seems as though geographically this might be a challenge in the sense that maybe it's describing something that like physically doesn't exist, if you will, which is the primordial water source. Somebody was going to say something?
I was going to say something about how much of this is connected to the concept of gods of rivers, river gods.
Well, in the sense that maybe, yeah, it's a polemic against people who say that these rivers are all gods of their own. Yeah, it could be. Um, could be.
Rabbi.
The, I mean, there definitely is, if you think of, there's definitely a understanding here that it's all coming from God and God's making all this happen. So yeah, it could be. It could be a somewhat of a polemic against these gods being, significant on their own. It's possible. Just like the priestly author who's not as into polemics, but definitely kind of asserts that, yeah, God created the big sea monsters. Yeah, God created those. It's just like a thing for him. He creates stuff. And again, I didn't want to dwell on it so much because it's like, it's so obvious and I mentioned it and it can be mentioned all the time. Look, both of these creation stories are so maybe more chapter one verse than chapter two, but chapter one is so different from every other creation narrative we have around the world because every other creation narrative, even if they have similar language or if they have, people look at the words like Enuma Elish, which is the great Babylonian epic that we found in a few sources, the creation story that Babylonians had. Talks about these creations of gods who basically fight with each other. And out of those fights, humanity is created, the world is created. But there's always multiple gods. They're always killing each other. The next generation is always killing the previous generation. I mean, it didn't start in Greek mythology. Greek mythology borrowed a lot of that stuff from Egyptian and Babylonian. And maybe it's, as Freud said, it's just psychological. It's like everybody's playing out their own personal story against it. But yeah, I mean, we just don't have any other creation stories like Genesis chapter one, which basically are that people, were created not out of anger or spite or out of some war, but because God wanted to create and made creation happen almost again as kind of like a blueprint for there's like a blueprint behind it and there's a stability and God wanted there not to be chaos, if you will, which like almost all the other creation stories are like, no, chaos is always there. Like chaos is there constantly. The J author is a little bit less into that. It's definitely not his agenda to promote stability. And he's actually more explaining, as you'll see, why we have chaos. And to some extent, his stories are a little closer to some of the pagan narratives that we have. So that's why Jay is a little closer to those. And while you'll have more anthropomorphic, God will be much more like a human being in the Jay story. So when God blows into the nostrils of the first human being, that's very anthropomorphic. I mean, that's a God that is much more active than the transcendent God of chapter one, where God is the great clockmaker. All right. Now, exactly what I just mentioned, God doing stuff like with his God's say with God's own hands. Here's what God did.
The eternal God settled the human in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And the eternal God commanded the human, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die.
Yeah.
But the tree of life is okay.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, people forget that, right? They forget that part. So it says God took literally Vayikach Adonai, he took the Adam and he put, I say the Adam because that's what it says, the human, the Ha-Adam. He's still called the human here. He's going to just be called Adam. They will say that. But right now he's still Adam. And he literally, it's like he took him. He like placed him. Vayikach. He took him. He took him and he placed him. And it says settled, but Vayikach literally means he took. And he put him there, and he put him there to till it and tend it, which tells us that from the beginning, the experiment, this is why I say it's more of a laboratory, is that we're going to see Adam's job is to take care of Eden. So there's work to be done in Eden by a human being. It says so right away. It's avodah, it's work. And it's also to guard it, to protect it. Protect it. So he's in Eden by himself. And here's the critical point.
Hey, Rabbi.
Yeah.
I was on mute before, so I missed it. But one, I am really glad we're going through this slowly, because there's things that we did 4.5 years ago or whenever we did it that we went so quickly I missed it. But if you scroll up and it's interesting, right? You've got birds and seeds and trees and food, and then I'm not harping on this. It just catches my eye, right? And like gold, right? So
Yeah.
even before the first human was put on, it's almost like in anticipation of a monetary or a trade system. God knew, maybe based on, because you said this was an experiment, maybe based on past experiments, that these beings on this planet are going to need something to trade with. I don't know.
So it's an interesting midrash.
Gold. Why not silver?
No, John, it's a really interesting midrash. I haven't heard it. I'll see if it exists. But you're actually right in pointing out that before we even get Eve, now again, it says that this is going to be important for the gold. That we have this understanding that now the easy answer is that the story is explaining what these rivers are and what role they play, and like they're important because that's where the gold is, right? Havilah is that area of, we believe they're talking about this area of Arabia and Yemen, which is where these gold mines were. And so that area, that's where the gold is, right? Now you could just say, hey, they're talking about an area and they're reminding you what's in that area, right? They're saying it's like it's anachronistic because they don't need money yet. But there is an interesting midrash here. I mean, the rabbis would definitely say that's worth explaining. That before, I wonder if there is. Something tells me that somebody must have said that before. But it's a wonderful midrash, because what John just shared is that before almost anything, before like human beings are created, and even before Eve is created, you got to have money. and this it's parentheses, right? It's parenthetical because it's like you just threw that in there as an explanation. That totally isn't necessary for the explanation. But in the midrash, nothing is a throwaway. Nothing, just because it's parenthetical doesn't mean it's not important. It's actually just like, oh, and we're going to throw that in as a reminder. But isn't it interesting that even before Adam is given like direction to start working, because here he's told, well, we're told he's going to work. But isn't it interesting that even before there's work, there's money? Look, you 100% create a great midrash out of that, which is that there's money necessary because everything that's going to flow out of it is going to be based on commerce and on having an exchange. So it's interesting that it's there. One could also make the argument that it's gold, bdellium, and lapis lazuli, which is all precious stones and precious metals. You need all this because if Eve is going to come along, you got to have something for her to buy, right? You gotta give her.
You could say that the list of importance is inverted, with the most important thing last.
But you gotta get. What are you going to give her for Valentine's Day? All of those things, right?
That is so funny.
You got to get it ready. So it's definitely interesting how it's a great midrash, John. I'm going to look to see if anyone's ever pointed out that the gold has to be there before virtually anything else. Everything else is going to come after that. So they're given permission to eat of all the trees. Any of the stuff is good, and you're allowed to eat even of the tree of immortality of life, but you cannot eat of the tree of knowledge of good and bad. And remember, it's not the tree of good and bad; it's the tree of knowledge of good and bad. That's important because um, the word is da'at. The word is knowledge right here. Da'at tovara. So it's not like it's the tree. Some people are like, gosh, yeah, they couldn't eat of the tree of good and bad because it's bad. Like there's bad stuff in it. No, it's knowledge. The tree represents awareness. I mean, this is awareness. This is consciousness. This is knowing right from wrong. So, so yeah, keep that in mind. What do they lose by eventually eating that? Well, let's get to it. Let's get to the thing. It's coming here soon. Don't worry. So they're given and they're given one commandment, right? They've given one. Now, some people say, well, they were given the commandment to be fruitful, multiply in chapter 1. But one could say that that's not really a commandment in the sense that it's the same commandment that animals are given. Animals are told be fruitful and multiply. It's more of a directive. It's more of an instinct. Here, human beings are given one commandment. They're given one commandment.
What about
Don't eat
animals
of
eating from the tree of good and knowledge, the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Animals eat from trees.
It's an interesting question. It's not one that is not significant because uh, when we get to the serpent, it seems like the serpent has some knowledge of this. But we would have to assume that based on what we see in that scene, animals are also not allowed to eat of that. It also almost, you make the argument that human beings are maybe allowed to eat of the tree of life and animals aren't. But animals haven't been created yet, so in all fairness, they're not there yet. So there's only human beings have been given the commandment. They're given one commandment, right? So it's been pointed out several times that human beings will eventually get, the Jewish people will get 10 commandments. If we add up all the Torah commandments, there's 613 commandments. People say, I can't keep all the commandments. And I would say, yeah, you can't keep one commandment. How do we know that? Because human beings are given one commandment and they can't keep it. So it doesn't matter how many commandments you're given, you will not keep them. That doesn't mean you're allowed to not keep them. It just means you are a human being and you are created with such impulses, and some could say lack of control of the impulses. It's not just that you have the impulses, but that you have no impulse control. You can be given one commandment and you can't follow it. So this is also an explanation of human weakness and the fact that if you can't keep one commandment and yet we're not destroyed, don't worry about not keeping all 10 or all 613 and getting destroyed. The purpose of the commandments is to keep us alive. But let's keep in mind that what really happens in this story by the time you finish it. But we are given the commandment not to eat of it, okay? And it says, if we eat of it, we will die. It is flat out said, we will die. It doesn't say how we'll die. It just says you will die. Any
The eternal
questions?
God said, "It is not good for the human to be alone. I will make a fitting counterpart for him." And the eternal God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and all the birds of the sky, and brought them to the human to see what he would call them. And whatever the human called each living creature, that would be its name. And the human gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to all the wild beasts, but no fitting counterpart for a human being was found.
Oh, so human beings gave names to all of the animals, and that's why we call them that, because human beings gave it to them. In this story, God created man first and then the animals. And the reason that God created the animals was not so that there'd be cool animals walking around the garden and God, and first of all, that he could eat them. Doesn't say he could eat them. Uh,
Implied.
it's not only is that not implied, that doesn't see. And I'm going to tell you a couple things today. I'm going to tell you two things today that are going to blow your mind about Genesis chapter 2 and the way the rabbis, our ancestors, our rabbinic ancestors in the Talmud and Midrash interpreted these amazing stories. Because these stories, by the way, are set for a whole lot of Midrash based on this. Oh my gosh, there's so much. It's and you've learned it. The people who are in our Midrash class, but we just read it years and years ago. I don't expect you to remember this, but we didn't do this Midrash because this Midrash is so disturbing in some ways that I said it's going to blow your mind. When it says that God says to them, I need to make a fitting counterpart for him, and you know where this is going to lead, right? The midrash on this is that God created these animals for not for Adam to eat, but to enjoy. Yeah, for his own pleasure. Now that's the rabbinic midrash, one of the midrashim on this. And if you're going to say, well, that's crazy. Yeah, it's not that crazy. In the level of where midrash goes that you're like, how did they get there? That's not the case because the word here, right here, is I need to make an ezer kenegdo. I need to make a fitting counterpart for him. And guess what? You know who that ezer kenegdo is going to be? Eve.
Wait. Can you say that again?
I'm going to show you when we get to when Eve gets created. But when God says it's not good for the human to be alone, I will make a fitting counterpart for him. He is talking about to complete him.
Where's that sentence?
We
I don't
have
Right
see that
here.
sentence. I see, but
It
no
is
fitting
not, it
counterpart
is
for
not
human.
good for human. Ezer, I will make for him an ezer kenegdo. Keep in mind that Hebrew phrase, which is fitting counterpart for him when we get to Eve. Eve is
so
that fitting counterpart.
so the rest of the animals were created to see if one of them would be a good companion or counterpart, if you will, for Ha'adam.
That's what it says. It literally says that.
So God doesn't know. Adam gets to decide.
Yeah, let's read the whole thing. I kind of jumped the gun on that a little bit
Mhm.
because there's another one I'm going to blow your mind with too, which also isn't so in the scheme of like on the rabbinic charts of how did they just say that? These ones are not that off the charts. Here it
So
goes.
the eternal God cast a deep
Yeah.
sleep upon the human, and while he slept, God took one of his sides and closed up the flesh at that site. And the eternal God fashioned the side that had been taken from the human into a woman, bringing her to the human. Then the human said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called the woman, for from the man was she taken. Hence, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so that they become one flesh. The two of them were naked, the human and his wife, yet they felt no shame.
So we're going to stop there, even though we could have stopped here. And it says that Adam was put into a deep sleep by God, right? And we don't have that word a lot. Tardema in Hebrew means like he knocked him out. The one of the few times we have that word in Hebrew is the sleep that Jonah goes into when he's on the boat. He also goes into a tardema. It's like full on, you've been knocked out. And it says that he sleeps. So he's in a sleep, he's in a stupor. And then it says he splits him. He takes off one of his sides. The same word there's vayikach. He took it. So he literally took it out of Adam. Now we sometimes translate that as a rib, which some people say is an explanation for why women have one less rib set than men, but that's not true necessarily. So it's a again one of these myths of one of these
Just so story.
yeah.
Mhm.
This is how it came to be. So
There's a lot in in these two sections,
yeah.
clauses, subsections. Like we jumped from creating a woman to a family and a wife. I mean, you know, Adam and Eve aren't even parents yet, right? So it's I think that's pretty interesting. Why is it grayed out? Why is 23 grayed? At least on
Where?
mine it is.
Oh, I don't know. I'm
Huh.
not sure. Well, they might have
Oh,
done this because this is what Adam says, right? So Adam says, I'm calling her, right? So Adam names everything, and now he's named her, right?
because it's capitalized, even though God did.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
He's still called Ha-Adam. He's calling her Isha because she came from the Ish. Now she hasn't been named Eve yet, but understand here that when he looks at it, right? When he looks at it and her, right? He says, "Oh yeah, this is the one. I want this one." And of course, part of the story is, and because he's from her flesh, he wants to be with her. And they use this in weddings sometimes. It's not used at a lot of Jewish weddings, but it's used in some weddings to describe um, why men and women want to be with each other because they're taken from one flesh, right? This is the bone of my bones, the flesh of my flesh. Now, so some people say, okay, so then that's not a very good it's not a very good explanation. You can't really use that for a same-sex union, right? Because like the flesh wants to be together, and so it unifies as a couple. Now, for all of you who think that the rabbis would interpret this as being that's all that's going on here, the rabbis actually look at the Hebrew and they say when it says that he took, and this is why this translation here says one of his sides, the Septuagint is the Greek translation is the one that says ribs. But the word in Hebrew, matzolotav, really implies a side. And the rabbis knew that, which is why they said the reason that the first creation story says that God created male and female at the same time was because the first human that was created until this moment is a hermaphrodite, is both male and female. So the rabbi said that 2,000 years ago. Now, if that's the case, it explains why he's put to sleep and the split happens there because you have to literally split the human being into a male and female entity. Is that possible? I guess on the rabbinic scale of that's insane. That's about a 4, a 3 maybe. It's not that extreme. Now I shared this story
What
once in a very
animals? There are frogs and things that change sex regarding
correct.
gender.
But what happens here, what blows people's minds, and I said there's one mind-blowing thing, which is that the animals seem to have been created at a very literal level, and it's midrashic. It exists in the midrash that God basically created these animals, seeing if Adam wanted to sleep with any of them, if he was physically attracted to them.
Is this the
That's what
first time
midrash
they
says.
use the word ish and isha?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is
Just
an explanation for why it's man. That's why women, it's why it says that women is Isha, because it's from Ish. But look, that these are all, there's so many of these myths and explanations for why things are the way they are. Again, just so stories, as Rosemary said, that's a good way of describing it. But they're myths. They're explanations for how things are the way they are. That's what Jay loves doing and telling us, like the gold. Hey, that's why there's gold up there, because God created that section up there with the river, and that's why it's there. That's God made it like that. But this story, think about it. If the first human being was a hermaphrodite, then if somebody is created as a hermaphrodite, as I said, one of the places I taught this was in a very conservative group that were arguing that we were having a discussion about Prop 8 20 years ago. And I said, look, the reality is that it's at least possible, according to the rabbis, that the first human being was actually created as a hermaphrodite. So when
I
we
don't see
talk
it. I'm
about
not reading between the lines. I don't see what you're seeing.
that God took one of his sides and made Eve out of it. Here it doesn't even use it tells you that it says ribs in some cases. The word literally is side. So God took one of the sides of Adam and created Eve out of it.
Oh, like maybe even split them in half.
Correct. They literally chopped them in two. That the first human being had both organs, which tells us that, number one, that's why it could say in Genesis chapter 1 that God created male and female at the same time. Now, that's the midrash that this is a hermaphrodite is a possibility. It's also a possibility that God just took some of Adam, and it's very possible that it was a side, that it was a rib, sorry, that he took something out of Adam to make Eve and then made the point is that Eve is made out of us, out of the man. I said us, out of the man. The woman came out of the man. Now this explains not why men are in charge of their women. No,
Huh?
we're going to get that, by the way, in the next story. But what we have here is an explanation for why a man wants to be with a woman, because it's a reunification of the original flesh. So that's why a man that's why a man will even leave his family, right? That's why a man leaves his father and mother. Why does he have such an attachment to his mother and father to his wife, that he won't even listen to his mom and dad anymore? Because he's in love. He's in love. So now you can make the argument that women do the same thing. I mean, in our case, in my wife's case, it's a flip, man. I didn't leave my mother and father, but yeah, this is heavy duty. Uh, so yeah, it explains it. It explains that desire, or that, yeah. I mean, I was hesitant to use the word desire, but let's use the word desire. A lot going on here. And that's why I said the two things that are kind of blow your
About
mind is I just said
instinct.
there's a traditional rabbinic insight that Adam and Eve, that Adam was first supposed to see if any of the animals tickled his fancy, so to speak, or it's a very British thing to say, or that again that the first human being that was created was actually a hermaphrodite. Both of those are traditional 2,000-year-old explanations. So
Judith, how about obligation?
well, we don't have, by the way, we have human beings and they're naked, but they don't have any shame. And that's a really important understanding. And this is the word for shame. Yit bosheshu. They don't have shame. That's different than guilt, by the way. I want to point that out. There's a different word for guilt in Hebrew.
Where else does that word yitboshishu, shame, specifically show
Come
up?
a
Where
few
else does
times,
it show up?
a few times in J. I don't know that the priestly author ever uses the word shame. The priestly author uses the word guilt a lot, right? A sham, the guilt offering, is done a lot. There's a sham is used a lot. I don't think that it is. We're going to talk about that hopefully today, this idea of shame versus guilt, but he doesn't seem at this stage, he has no shame. Walking around naked, it seems to me like there's sex happening. There's definitely interest. I like this one.
Yes, we do.
Now, let's read the story, the second part.
One second, Rabbi. If you go to 25 and click on,
Yeah.
I guess it's I or L. Two of them were
Yeah,
naked. L.
it's arum, which means
What's your play on shrewd?
yeah, because the word arum is off that the word naked isn't used a lot too, but it is the word we use. They're saying it could be a play on the word shrewd in the sense that they were I mean, obviously there's a commentary on this one, which let's just see if any of the commentaries no, it's not really an explanation of the
No.
of Arum. Let me just see if there's anything else in English that we can look at the here it is. So uh so Ibn Ezra, who lived after Rashi, who's Spanish, Rashi is French. He's a Spanish scholar, says that um uh they were the word arum here is that they were shrewd, they were prudent in the sense that they don't go the way of saying that they're frolicking. On the contrary, arum they think means that uh they had their act together still at this point, and that's why they didn't have shame. They had nothing to be embarrassed about yet,
Right.
which is
Self-control.
yeah, which is an interesting idea, but I don't. I think the point of this is that they're innocent. I mean, that's my take on this. I'm in a literal reading of this. The people right now are innocent, and innocent doesn't necessarily mean that they're not having sex. It just means they're having sex or they're enjoying their lives, and they're not. Their eyes haven't been opened yet. Let's put it that way. And now we're going to get into the second part of this, which is the snake. Now, again, it's almost rushing this because we could spend the remaining 20 minutes just talking about the consequences of the human being and the woman being created. But if you don't, if you don't tell the second part in the same time, then you're really almost doing a disservice. You can't hold on to this overnight. Like if you're a director, if you're making this story, you can't use this as the cliffhanger can't be here because the 1-2 punch of what happens in these next verses is important. So,
Rabbi,
yes.
uh, I'd like to, before we get on to number three,
Yeah.
I'd like to say one other thing that I've been thinking about since we
Yeah.
started this, which it's a step back from what we've been talking about, but it has to do with the act of creation and creativity. And it occurs to me that when man or the human takes part in the creation and starts naming things, he is acting in God's image. And what it does to me is elevate the act of creativity to a holiness. To we have throughout the history of art, but it's not just art and work. It's everything and energy where we see that artists have God speaking to them, either through a traditional muse, if it's in mythology, or writers who talk about the writing just comes from outside of himself or herself, and it does the writing. And it strikes me that the act of creativity or the use of imagination, in this case, which we haven't talked about, imagination, is the essential nature of man, and maybe how it's separated from the animal kingdom. This sense of holiness in making something from nothing, um, is what God has done in this laboratory, and it's what humans do every day, whether it's making a Sabbath dinner, or whether it's writing a poem, or creating music, or anything, making the mundane meaningful. It seems
Yeah.
like that's a very godlike thing. And I know it's a little different from what we've talked about, but I'm encouraged by the lack of speed to offer this comment, because even though it might be a digression from what we're talking about, it just strikes me as important and significant as to who we are. If we're defining ourselves through God, then imagination, art, creativity, work, all of that is embodied in this sense of making or doing, an imaginative way of looking at life.
You're
Okay.
100% right. And thank you, Floyd, so much for pointing that out. Because Floyd actually texted me about this concept of God speaking and bringing it into creation, which we touched on, but we didn't. That could have been a whole nother way of looking at it, is God creating by speech. And and there's no question that the creative act of Adam naming the animals is is 100%, as Floyd, really thank you for bringing us onto that, which is that this is him being like God, right? Naming the animals is huge because, again, God, like, is almost turning over that act, that final step of creation. I mean, he made them, but naming them is part of that creation, that creative act. So, it's interesting again, and I think Floyd, being a teacher and writer and understanding the power of words, is something that I appreciate, again, that you brought us back to that, which is, yeah, this is the way human beings are, harness their godlike power to create worlds. I mean, my favorite version of
Like,
this is
yeah.
something that Floyd, I know, deeply appreciates, is Prospero in The Tempest. It's one of my favorite Shakespeare's works of Shakespeare, because it's also, some people say it's you know one of his most self-reflective things, which is, Prospero creates this island, this reality. And it, again, as a playwright, is he the creator of these worlds that, that he had worked on over his life. And I think, yeah, for people who've especially been involved in the arts and realize the amazing worlds that people create through literature and through performance and music, that people have this amazing, we have this godlike power. I mean, and again, you talked about the other thing. I mean, cooking, so many things that we do that become uh, powerful, holy, productive acts, which are divine. So yeah, this is definitely part of the naming of what Adam does, is God's partner in that. And the rabbis noticed that right away. I mean, it's a big part of God allowing us to be partners in creation with God, is God lets us take on this responsibility of naming the animals. Yeah, thank you for bringing us to the important part of it. I gave you the more shock part of it, which is that he named them just to see if he was going to enjoy their presence a little bit more. Again, it's like crazy that's one of the midrashim. But again, there's a point to this, which is these animals are in our lives too, and some of them are in our lives more than we necessarily want. As I'm thinking about, the fact that one of my responsibilities here in San Diego is to look after the dog, but it's not the dogs we got to worry about, folks. It's the snakes. Now, thanks to John also for pointing out the note here on our room, which is here translated as naked. It also has a connection to shrewd or prudent. And why do we know that? Because the first three words of the next chapter, Vahanachash haya arum. Now, the serpent wasn't naked. Well, he was naked, but aren't serpents usually naked? No, the serpent was shrewd. It's the same word. So Ibn Ezra's connection here is these two words, arumim and arum. Yeah, it's more than naked, right? There's a language, there's a linguistic play here, which may have been intentional, may not have been intentional, but look, it's literally the next line. So let's look at what happens here, and I will tell you, we will have your minds blown by what happens in this very famous story.
Now, the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that the eternal God had made. It said to the woman, "Did God really say, 'You shall not eat of any tree of the garden'?" The woman replied to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It is only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, 'You shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die.'" And the serpent said to the woman, "You are not going to die, but God knows that as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like divine beings who know good from and bad."
So notice that the serpent seems to be knowing what's going on and they don't know it. So this either is the serpent's been eating of the tree, the serpent has information that Eve doesn't have. A lot of people point out that he goes to Eve, he doesn't go to Adam, which is part of the dynamic here in this story that's so critical. But yeah, serpent says, it's not that you're going to die, it's that you're going to know good and bad. And here's what happens.
When the woman saw that the tree was good for eating and a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they perceived that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. They heard the sound of the eternal God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day, and the human and his wife hid from the eternal God among the trees of the garden. The eternal God called out to the human and said to him, "Where are you?" He replied, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat of the tree from which I had forbidden you to eat?" The human said, "The woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." And the eternal God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" The woman replied, "The serpent duped me, and I ate." Then the eternal God said to the serpent, "Because you did this, more cursed shall you be than all the cattle and all the wild beasts. On your belly shall you crawl, and dirt shall you eat." Scroll, please. "All the days of your life, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. They shall strike at your head, and you shall strike at their heel." And to the woman, God said, "I will greatly expand your toil and your pregnancies. In hardship shall you bear children. Yet your urge shall be for your husband, and his will shall prevail over yours. To Adam, God said, because you did as your wife said and ate of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you. By toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it sprout for you, but your food shall be the grasses of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you get bread to eat until you return to the ground. For from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return.
So we read a lot just now, and I really feel like, again, we probably should have done this over 2 times, because we just read the story of the eating of the fruit. First of all, the fruit is not an apple. It doesn't say apple. It says that they were eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Now, there's a lot happening here. And this is a story that serves as one unit, and it serves as a unit right next to the other story, which is how Adam and Eve are created. And immediately the relationship seems to go south. There's blame, there's accusations, there's a whole bunch of stuff. And the rabbis point out there's stuff in here that you didn't even see. So, for example, it says that when the serpent says when Eve says to the serpent about the trees that are allowed to, it says, "You shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die." Now, God never said you can't touch it. God says you can't eat of it. Now, there's an interesting midrash here, which is that Adam, when he's telling Eve the rules, he tells Eve, don't eat it. Don't even look at it. Don't touch it. You're going to die if you touch it. Now, God never said that. Now, the interesting lesson from that, the midrashic lesson from that, is that the serpent touches the fruit at that point. He goes, look, I'm touching it. Nothing's happened. I'm not dying. Touch it. Go up, Eve, touch it. She touches it and she doesn't die. And so when she touches it and doesn't die, now she thinks it's not really true. Adam exaggerated. Now, he did exaggerate about touching it. And the rabbis point out that if you are told not to do something, and then you make the next rule too hard for the next person to follow, it could wind up being really bad. So don't tell somebody something that makes it even harder to do, because it may backfire on you. Just because you think you're making the rules a little bit harder, and then it won't happen. You can make the rules so hard that people just break them because there's no consequence for breaking like the outer rule. So they'll just break it, and they'll break the other rules too. So there's an interesting midrash here, which is be careful how hard you make the rules. It's not said here, but it's kind of implied because of this. Don't even touch it. Where did that come from? And so that's the midrash. That's the part that isn't necessarily there, but it may be implied. Also, of course, what happens when you eat from it? It means you will know. You will know, like divine beings. You will be like, it doesn't just say God, it says divine beings, which we assume also means like the angels. Now, we haven't read anything about angels yet. It doesn't say anything. You haven't missed it. We've read 2.5 chapters at this point of really 2 chapters and 6 verses of the Torah so far. Not one word of angels. Some people say it's implied when God says, let us make man. We didn't talk about that last week. Why is it the royal we when God says, let us make man? Some people say he's speaking to the angels. Some people say he's just using the royal we. But maybe there's angels. There's wonderful midrashim about the angels. Wonderful midrashim, which are that the angels don't want people to be created because, as we're going to see, people in the next story, we'll save it for the next weak, but people are just, they're just at their core bad. Well, knowing good and bad is not necessarily going to help them. That's not helping them because once they eat of the tree, what happens to them? It's more than just they didn't follow God's word. They have a whole different take on themselves. They have awareness now, and that awareness creates shame. They knew they were naked. Now, notice God confronts them and doesn't say right away, you broke the law. I gave you a law and you broke it. He asks them a question, and of course, they answer it with not the question, not the answer, but you know, God knows by their answers what had happened. It's like when a parent asks a child, what did you do? They know what they did. You ask the child, what did you do? Because to some extent, you want them to explain and to show that they know that what they did was wrong. Now, the interesting thing is what actually Adam says to him. The word that God says to Adam here is ayeka, where are you? And he says, I hid. I heard you, and I was afraid. And so I hid. Now, of course, you can't hide from God. Also, it seems that like God is walking in the garden, right? Which is very anthropomorphic, that God is like literally in the garden with them. But yeah, in this scene, they don't answer. He doesn't answer the question. He said, where are you? He says, I'm hiding. Now, I was taught years ago, a very powerful teaching here, which is the first question that God asks of a human being. The first question. This is the first question. The first question is ayecha, one word in Hebrew. Where are you? Ayecha. Where are you? So if that's the first question to Adam, it's essentially the first question for humanity. Where are you? And Adam doesn't answer it. Adam is not ready to answer it. Because what's the answer for ayecha?
Hineni.
Word. Exactly. There's only one word. It's a one-word question with a one-word answer. And the answer you're supposed to say is hineni, here I am. And Adam can't do it. Adam isn't prepared to do it.
Another thing,
Yeah.
the next sentence, he was afraid because he was naked. So he's not ashamed to be naked in front of the female, but he's ashamed to be, unless he's creating the first lie. He was ashamed to be naked in front of God.
Yeah, he's ashamed. We're going to get to that too. Yeah, that's important too. But I just want to just finish one more thing about the Hineni part because
Sorry.
everybody knows I've talked so much about Hineni over the years, but it's partly because of the beautiful setup here at the beginning. Because again, every one of us is essentially asked that question, Hineni. Aika, where are you? And the answer is Hineni. We're challenged at some point in our lives to answer that question. Where are you? At some point, we are going to be asked that question. We've probably already been asked that question, but at some point, we have to answer that question. And again, the first person who answers correctly is
Abraham.
Abraham. The first Jew, and what makes the first Jew? The ability to say, Hineni, I'm here. And all the other people who say Hineni, Jacob and Moses and the heroes of our Bible who say Hineni are the ones who are willing to step up in a difficult situation, which he's most definitely in, and say, yeah, I'm here. I'm ready. If he's ready to take the consequences of this. Interestingly, again, Adam has any sense of taking responsibility. I mean, none of this happens, without him eating from the tree, right? But what's interesting again is his feeling of shame. And I just want to finish with this today, which is there's a difference in what happens with us between shame and guilt. Guilt, we talk a lot about as Jews because we talk about Jewish guilt and we talk about how pervasive it is in Judaism. And I will tell you this guilt is not something we should always be living with. I'm not saying we should always feel guilty, but guilt is actually a recognition you did something wrong. It's a recognition that you have a responsibility that you didn't fulfill. You had to do something, you didn't do it. You did something wrong and you can correct it. Shame is something completely different. Shame is, and people have written about this, by the way, that there's essentially a very different situations, different cultures that are based on guilt, and there's ones that are based on shame. Uh, the West, and specifically, I would say Judeo-Christian or especially maybe Judaism, is based on guilt, sense of responsibility. You didn't do what you were supposed to do. You weren't there to say Hineni, and so you're guilty. I did something wrong. Shame, which is oftentimes the root of societies and civilizations, uh, cultural understandings in the East, is a sense of shame, which is something is wrong with me, that it's bad because people will look at me and think bad about me. Adam here has a sense of shame, but he doesn't have a sense of guilt. He now has self-awareness. He now has desire. Saw that stuff. I wanted it. I took it. But instead of feeling a sense of guilt for breaking the rules, he's ashamed. It's still about him. And it's still about what other people, in this case, what God will think of him, not understanding that what God really wants is him to take responsibility.
He's putting the guilt on other people.
Exactly. And that's oftentimes what shame does, is there's no responsibility, right? I blame you, God, because you gave me Eve. He doesn't just say, Eve did it. You put her there. That's insane, but it's very human. This is an explanation for everything a human being does to not take responsibility. Again, it's been said that one of the reasons why, ritual suicide was accepted in certain cultures and certain societies was because it was just better to not be here than to be ashamed. Not like I did something wrong, I'm taking responsibility, I'm going to fix it. This idea of shame and the fact that what human beings have the power to do is a lot of bad stuff, as we're going to see in the coming weeks. So far, the bad thing they did was they ate. In the scope of like things that people do that are bad, the Bible knows this isn't the worst thing, but we're going to see an arc here. We're going to see an arc over the next few stories. The Cain and Abel story, the flood story. We're going to see an arc where what really happens is that and again, I don't want to give away too much or kind of what we're doing here, but we're going from this this mistake here to something that's going to be much darker when human beings turn on each other. Now,
it could be also, I don't know if we discussed this, that the serpent being the shrewdest was a plant. God was testing I know it's wild, but that's why I read into it. It's like,
No,
what was
you're very
God's
right,
agenda?
which is why maybe you've seen this before. Those bumper stickers that say Eve was framed. The reason is when
Ah,
you read this, you understand that this is a test. This is the laboratory. And to some extent, what we are left with is that, you know, there was what we come out with was, of course, what Genesis does, especially the J authors. This is why things are. We don't live forever, but we have awareness. We have consciousness, and that's the cost of being human. That's the cost of being mortal. Can't have both. If you live in the garden with complete innocence and a lack of self-awareness, you can live forever. But you can't have both. Human beings don't have both. Can't have both. We're not divine, and divine beings have both. We don't have both. Now, one could say that's the simple answer for it, but I think it's really at least what the J author is really trying to get across, which is there's a cost for consciousness. There's a cost for the system we have. But you know what? It's okay. Now, we're going to finish with a song today. And unless, again, I don't want to rush through this, but I want to finish with a song. And I'm going to share the song here. And as I began, we're hoping to have Joe Buchanan come out. This is a song from my friend Joe Buchanan. And he explains this song. And I'm going to actually I'm going to post up the lyrics as we're listening to this song. This song he wrote for Eve, which I think he also wrote it for his wife April, who's a wonderful person. But I'm going to share you this song called For Eve, and it's what we're going to finish with today. Sorry we kind of rushed it, okay, but a lot.
Where would we be if the world didn't taste so sweet? Would we be the partners that we were meant to be? 'Cause in that garden was life. You could only grow so high. We were never eternal, but living on given time. Hey. And when God made you, it was no mistake. Creation, it was done and it was good, for goodness sake. If you wanted to grow out of that garden, you had to go to struggle out in the world. And that coming of age meant we were lifted right off the page, or to soar high and earn the right to be inscribed. When God made you, it was no mistake. Creation, it was done and it was good, for goodness sake. And when you chose us with the fruit you ate, you gave us a chance to reflect the light that God made. Where would we be if not for Eve? Not night for Eve.
Yeah, it's a beautiful midrash. It's a beautiful understanding, and it's a beautiful way of recognizing and maybe re-understanding, reinterpreting why we have this story. We did not talk about Lilith today, but maybe again next week we're going to explain why we have a story of Lilith to rectify, to bring these stories together. But it's a perfect song to think about, especially as we move into Valentine's Day, which is not a Jewish holiday, but it's a romantic song. And I think it's a really nice tribute to recognize and to maybe do a little teshuva to make up for thousands of years of women being marginalized because of that story being really kind of misinterpreted. We saw the punishments that got laid down for everybody and what ended up having to happen. But think about it. It literally says we would children have been born? Would there be any of us if it wasn't for this experience and if it wasn't for Eve? So we will definitely be looking at that next week as we get ready for the next story, the story of Cain and Abel and the first family. So thank you, and we'll definitely ask everybody if you want to be part of our Wednesday night class tomorrow night. We'll be online for Jewish history, looking at the part of the Bible that we finished with Chronicles, and then also through the Persian period and through the right up to the rabbinic period. So we'll be explaining a little bit about how the Bible came into existence during this time, and also, part of Jewish history that we don't know a lot about. And then we'll also hopefully see you Friday night at Shabbat with Wendy. And again, have a wonderful week ahead. And thank you everybody for being here today.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Rabbi.
to all the
See
women.
you.
Thank you to all the Eves, modern day Eves. Bye-bye.
See you Friday.
Bye-bye.